You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum.
Today, we're bringing you a special Halloween episode of Precinct 444. We are going to be going back to Colonial America and examining the infamous Salem Witch Trials. The Salem Witch Trials took place from 1692 to 1693 and culminated in the accusation of over 200 individuals with the conviction and execution of 20 people for committing witchcraft. While these 2 years were the most tumultuous in Salem, witchcraft trials were happening in all 13 colonies and countries all over the world, motivated mostly from paranoia grounded in a culture of maintaining religious piety. Many of the laws forbidding witchcraft, passed years before the events in Salem took place, were deeply grounded in religious beliefs. This episode is hosted by Anna Muckenfuss, the museum's manager of education and host of Precinct 444's Law and Disorder. It features Thomas Canavan, the museum's executive director, Christopher Mitchell, our manager of digital content and strategy and the producer of the Precinct 444 podcast, and Bill Alexander, executive director of the memorial. So join us now as we navigate the history of the Salem Witch Trials. Here at the National Law Enforcement Museum, it's fun to bring in some additional content with our regular podcast content here at Precinct 444. And today, because in honor of kind of spooky season starting, Halloween coming up in a few days, I guess, we figured we'd take it way back in American history before we even had the United States as we know it today, back to Colonial America and talking about the Salem Witch Trials and just how witchcraft was initially prosecuted in the United States, something that we've been talking about kind of, or I suppose I should say the history of these events keeps coming up, and it really comes up a lot around this time of year because of all of the Halloween festivities and things of that nature. So I figured we'd talk about that a little bit today and get some fresh voices on the podcast as well to join us for this kind of quick story and just some additional good content for us to use. So how does that sound?
That sounds good.
All right. So we'll get started. The Salem Witch Trials that we'll talk about, the actual trials themselves happened in the 1690s. So I believe between 1692 and 1693. But it goes back a little bit further than that. So colonial laws really are the reason why the Salem Witch Trials happened. And some of the witchcraft laws that were really inspiring the ones that the Salem witches were prosecuted under started a little further back in that same century. So in New England, it was civil law that really dictated how citizens really conducted their business and their social life in ways that we really wouldn't tolerate now, mostly because those laws were greatly dictated by religion at the time.
What's the difference between a civil law and the laws we have today?
So it's pretty similar, but you have kind of, think of our current day court system. You have civil law, or you have the civil courts, and then you have criminal courts. So criminal courts, somebody's been arrested, they are being put on trial by the state to be prosecuted for a crime committed against the state. So they're going to serve some kind of prison sentence, something of that nature for that crime. Civil court is something where it's usually peer-on-peer type of issues rather than being even though a criminal act is typically something you commit against your peer, civil court, you don't necessarily have to have, you do have to have broken a law, but it's not something where the police are being called, you're being arrested and booked, and you're going to go to prison for it. Civil law is something more like you damaged my wall. I had to pay to fix it. It was your fault. I want you to pay me back. It's that kind of, more that kind of deal. And
so we still have civil laws.
We do still have civil laws. Civil laws are still very much in existence.
Okay.
And witchcraft was pretty much something that could only be enforced by civil laws. Doing things that witches would be doing technically wasn't a criminal act. Like saying that you had this weird dream and saw a vision, unless you seeing a vision of someone stealing someone's cat or whatever, isn't the actual act of going and doing it. So just saying like, I had a dream where my neighbor came over to my house and stole my favorite tea kettle, but so I might want to watch out for her. Just saying that doesn't mean the neighbor actually came over and saw the tea kettle. It just means I had a dream about it and I told it to a friend of mine. The friend thought it was really weird, so she's going to take that to the courthouse and say, like, I would like this to be investigated. And it would be investigated essentially in a courtroom by a judge, and the judge would decide whether or not it was considered witchcraft or not, or it was just some weird ale-induced dream. I don't know. But so this civil law and then the actual judgments that were being put down in these, or being handed down, I should say, in the colonial court system were greatly dictated by religion, which is something we don't do anymore. The Constitution pretty much put an axe to being able to use religion as justification for our laws, whether they be civil or criminal. And the Witchcraft Act of 1604, which was written over 150 years before the U.S. Constitution, it was the primary English law regarding witchcraft. And it was enforced in the colonies, even though it was technically written in Great Britain. It was one of England's laws on witchcraft. And it deemed that any act that could be considered witchcraft was a felony. So minor offenses would be essentially punished by imprisonment for 1 year. But then if a witch was found guilty twice, she was immediately sentenced to death. So it was it was even more strict than a 2 strikes and you're out rule. But under this act, a lot of the reasonings for why this act should be in place, written in the legislation, but then when a judge would actually have the accused in front of them and hand down their sentence, a lot of that justification would be from religious texts, which is kind of interesting because that's something we definitely don't do anymore.
Anna, what about sorcerers? It sounds like sorcerers are getting off the hook.
Well, technically, sorcerers and witches would be considered the exact same thing. So I'm actually going to get into kind of what these, kind of what could be considered a witchcraft offense, I guess I should say. But there are a few different things. Essentially, anything that could be deemed obscure could technically be considered witchcraft or the kind of reasoning to take this to the civil court. So as I was doing my research, offenses often include practices like consorting with demons or the devil. So I don't know. I don't think Ouija boards were a thing in the 1600s. I think that was something that's more of a modern day tool, but essentially Mattel. That was a Mattel. Other things like it, I'm sure, have existed long before Mattel decided to monopolize on it. But
no pun intended.
No pun intended, because they also created Monopoly. We love this. But any type of seance or any kind of activity, you have young kids who want to sit around a candle and just say, okay, let's see if we can talk to ghosts. Kids have been trying to occupy their time with weird things for centuries. As long as kids have existed, they've been trying to figure out they try to figure out their world, and that also sometimes means they're trying to figure out the things in the other world. So something like trying to communicate with demons or the devil, that's a big one. Entering into demonic pacts, going to the apothecary and trying to hex your neighbor for putting their fence up a few feet too far in front of your little hut or whatever. Though all of those kinds of things could be considered witchcraft in New England. And ultimately, it came down to who in the community you were associating with. So every neighborhood has that one guy or gal, whoever it may be, who's just a little off, whether it be on purpose or just their personality. There's always somebody who kind of rubs everybody the wrong way, may just have different interests. And these, in Salem especially, it kind of became this perfect way to kind of enforce that type of the type of behavior that they wanted to see in their communities.
Yeah, it's like a personality contest.
Exactly.
It's like, be like us, and if you're not, you're a witch.
We'll find a way to figure it out. And the witchcraft laws were a really good way to kind of weed out that kind of behavior and return to kind of enforce the status quo. Because both individually and collectively, colonists of New England were very deeply concerned with matters of moral and spiritual purity. Think about the reasons why colonists came over to America in the first place. They wanted religious freedom, was one of their main reasons. The King of England was trying to enforce the Anglican Church on everybody in his kingdom, and they Puritans who would have been in the Society of Salem, Massachusetts, and some of the earliest New England colonies, they didn't agree with the Anglican Church. So in order to have their religious freedom, they moved somewhere else. They started these colonies. And while they were still underneath the English crown, they were allowed to practice their own religion because they decided to leave, essentially. So they wanted to have these moral, spiritually pure communities, and that was the whole reason they came over. And then they would notice, even though we came over here with the purpose of having that kind of divine religious experience, and this one guy and his weird little activities are ruining it for all of us. He's ruining the vibe, and we need to get rid of it. So it was kind of a good way, whether they were actually practicing witchcraft or not, it was a good way to kind of take that control back from their community that they felt like they didn't have. And they had these fairly vague witchcraft laws that had started in England and ultimately came over with them in these colonies as a good way to kind of enforce that behavior, to enforce that type of culture within their communities. And Salem was no different. We mentioned the Witchcraft Act of 1604 was the original English law. But by the time that we got over to the colonies, by the time we created the Massachusetts Bay Colony, we're creating our own laws specifically for these colonies. And the main laws that were
So, Anna, were we allowed?
Here.
We were allowed to make our own laws here, even though we were under English rule?
Yes. So while we were underneath English rule, we understood that kind of like we have state and federal laws here, we kind of understood that each unique community, each state, as it would later become, you're going to have some kind of local laws that you're enforcing. So even in England, you would have kind of, and this goes back, this is kind of a connection to our exhibit and our exhibits and kind of our content here at the museum. The word sheriff comes from the English term, essentially shire reeve, which means like the head constable or kind of, I don't want to say decision maker, but law enforcement officer in a shire or like Lord of the Rings, but like a small village. So you would have, even though you're underneath the king's rule, he has these kind of officers in each individual, officers of the court within each individual village, because, in the 1600s, you don't have social media, you don't have email to just say, you can't pop a message into everyone's inbox that says, yeah, we don't allow witchcraft anymore, so I'm going to need you all to stop, or you're going to go to prison or die. You can't do that in the 1600s. So they have this, the king has all of these kind of individuals who kind of serve as a bullhorn for the king. He's going to send them if he writes a new law, he's going to send them a letter that says, hey, I changed this and I need you to enforce that now. And he's going to, it's somebody that the community trusts. They have a rapport, just like today's officers, today's sheriffs know their communities that they're serving. They know the people, they know the nuances of how everyone kind of gets along with one another, so that they can create a more kind of peaceful environment within their communities. They still have that. It still exists today because it started way back in colonial times. So they have these main laws that they're enforcing, but then they also have these local ordinances, because each individual community is going to have their own unique issues. So it, as a way to kind of deal with that, just like we have local laws and local ordinances today, they'd have something similar like that in colonial America. And for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was the Body of Liberties, which was written in 1641. It included witchcraft as one of its capital offenses, just like murder, burglary, things of that nature. Witchcraft is a capital offense in according to the Body of Liberties. And the stipulations of the law were inspired by that Witchcraft Act of 1604. It's, again, cited biblical sources for its authority. And so the separation of church and state still wasn't a thing at this point. One of these kinds of sources for authority says, if any man or woman be a witch that is hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. That's what the law says. And then they're saying that this is justified based upon Exodus chapter 22, verse 118, Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 6 and 10, and then Deuteronomy 17, verses 2 and 6.
Wow.
So they've actually gone through and said, okay, this is what we want the law to say, and this is why we say it.
I had no idea that witches were around in the Old Testament.
Right? Yeah.
Evidently. I didn't know that was a thing.
They were, and even the way that we kind of understand what witches are today, you have people that have these psychic abilities, as you might say. It's a really big thing on TikTok. You see it all the time. But just kind of a lot of us experience those kinds of things just in our everyday life. And we have a gut feeling. So, you wake up one day and you're like, oh, I feel like it's you just wake up and know that it's not going to be a great day. And then that's how it kind of turns out. And
then you become a witch.
And then
you're like, I'm a witch now.
That is what they would have considered witchcraft to be at the time. So if I woke up and had a headache and said, I just woke up this morning and know that it's going to be a rough day. And if I said that to the wrong person and they were like, yeah, she had a really rough day and she told me she knew that was going to happen before it actually happened, Anna's a witch. Because they would know that, because essentially they knew that before it actually happened, that would be considered witchcraft, even though it's mostly just they're listening to what their actual animal instincts are telling them about their environment and things like that, because kind of are as a way for humans to survive in the wild, just like animals have for as long as they have existed, we have these built-in systems biologically that are helping us to kind of avoid situations that may happen. And when we're not supposed to know what the plan for our lives are, and especially in Puritan society, when you're supposed to just trust that that your God has everything under control and whatever he does is for a reason, which still is very much practiced now in a lot of modern day religions. If you know that something's going to happen before it actually happens, that's someone essentially trying to be God, trying to play God, and that's not okay. So it's witchcraft. So it's just kind of going back to that kind of, you did something that's out of the ordinary in our society, it must be punished. So, but it's really interesting that it kind of goes back that far to they're citing the biblical sources for their justifications for this law. Yeah, so that was kind of an interesting little nuance that comes out of there. But this is how those laws were actually used in the Salem Witch Trials. So judges and magistrates would ask for evidence of witchcraft from witnesses. Often this evidence was presented in the form of witness testimony. So this testimony would be a witness describing dreams or visions that either were described to them by the witch or dreams they had about the person committing witchcraft. Because even though if a witch said, I had a vision to somebody else and that was considered witchcraft, you have somebody else who's accusing a person of being a witch that has a dream about that person being a witch can go and say, I had a dream about somebody being a witch. And the person they had the dream about is the one that's going to be prosecuted. So that makes a lot of sense. But some officials would even allow, some court testimony shows that the testimony of actual spirits were permissible during trial.
That makes sense.
Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We're going to practice witchcraft while we're trying someone for witchcraft. So
exactly.
The hypocrisy is definitely there.
So if a spirit came to Bill while he was dreaming one night, and the spirit gave him information,
yes,
and Bill told me that information, I could then go tell a judge about the spirit Bill was talking to.
Yes.
And then that would be legit.
You could tell the judge about the spirit Bill talked to, and then the judge, during Bill's trial, the judge could call in the spirit to come testify. Yeah, exactly. That's it. Some officials would allow for the testimony of spirits to be permissible during trial.
Wow.
But probably introduced through what they would deem to be some pure independent third party, like a priest or someone. The priest would say,
it would definitely be like a priest.
I am communicating with said spirit that Bill had a conversation with, and that spirit is telling me that they have done XYZ with Bill.
Yes. It would definitely be, they wouldn't just call the random neighborhood witch to come in because she'd be on trial.
Right, she'd be on trial.
So they would actually call in the priest, or they would, some member of the clergy would come in and communicate with the spirits, because it's okay for the clergy to communicate with spirits. They were chosen to, by, especially in Puritan society, anyone who's in the clergy, even though they're choosing typically to go into that profession, they're choosing that profession because they were called upon by the Holy Spirit to become a priest, to become a member of the clergy. And even in a lot of religions, that's kind of how it is as well. They feel this spiritual calling to do that. So they are allowed, they're the ones who are supposed to communicate with spirits. They're the ones that are supposed to be doing that work. And these accused witches are essentially doing that without being chosen. Like, they're stepping beyond the veil that they're not supposed to be allowed to go behind because they weren't chosen to do that profession. So exactly, it would be someone from the clergy that does that.
Got it.
Yeah. Like an expert witness that we would have in today's courtroom. But the accused were also being policed by volunteer police forces. So we talk about these in our exhibit as well. A lot of colonial policing at the time was done by volunteers. So we would have day or night watches that were kind of going through the neighborhood. If there was any trouble that was going on, a member of the community could just walk out to their street and say, like, hey, I'm going to need you to check this out. She's speaking in tongues. I'm going to need you to go check this out. And they could call those day and night watchmen as witnesses as well, if they were the ones who were initially called to kind of investigate this witchcraft too. And laws were being enforced for this long before the Constitution was on the horizon. We mentioned this lack of separation of church and state, but there were other legal rights that we possess today that were not available to the accused. So the right to a speedy trial, freedom from excessive bail, and even the protection against cruel and unusual punishment were not something that had to be practiced during this time. So a lot of the accused were often tortured while in jail. At least one of the convicted witches actually died in jail before the hysteria of the trials ended in 1693 from just the conditions of the jails themselves. A lot of kind of because of the beliefs of some of the people actually in the jails taking care of the inmates. There was no law that said they couldn't abstain from feeding them or things like that. So they were receiving a lot of unofficial punishment for their crimes before they even made it in front of a judge. Mm-hmm. And many of the accused were often held in jail for months before they even saw a trial. So that right to a speedy trial by a jury of our peers wasn't something that existed back then. So it meant that a lot of them just sat in jail for a very long time until it was their turn to go in front of the judge, which is kind of interesting.
Were men ever accused of witchcraft?
Yes, men were accused of witchcraft. Just because someone's a witch doesn't mean that the witch is necessary. All witches are women. There were men as well. There definitely weren't as many, but there were men that were tried of witchcraft as well.
Men were sorcerers and women were witches.
I think it just depended on...
I thought men were warlocks.
Yeah, I thought they were warlocks too.
Yeah.
I definitely remember a gender separation in the naming, but
but I think
or wizards.
Or wizards, that too.
Wizards and warlocks.
Wizards, warlocks, witches.
Harry Potter.
There's my input.
Old hags.
Yeah, Harry Potter.
There's all kinds of them.
Yeah, they all rode brooms.
They all rode brooms.
Gryffindor, Slytherin.
Yeah, oh boy. Oh, here we go.
We love that. I'm a Gryffindor. Thanks for asking.
Ravenclaw.
Hey, it's all good stuff. I do have a lot of the things that I do in my everyday life and decor in my house. I would definitely be considered a witch in Salem. But anyway, with this epidemic of witchcraft accusations, the legal system did need to change. So with tensions growing between colonies and England, a new system needed to be created.
So I have a quick question about that.
Yes.
So, people from other communities realized this was a little out of control.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yes.
Good. Okay.
Oh, yeah. They kind of realized, they're like, this seems to be just... It seems like people are just using these witchcraft laws as a way to get rid of their neighbors or even intimidate their neighbors that they find annoying, So on May 27th of 1662, a special court was established known as Oyster and Terminer, which means to head and to determine in Old English. This was going to decide on witch cases. So witchcraft laws had a specific court they were being tried in because so many people are saying, my neighbor's a witch. This lady that lives down the street is a witch, that they were trying more witchcraft cases in the criminal court instead of the criminal courts are being bogged down by all these witchcraft cases. They didn't have enough courtrooms to kind of go through them all. So they decided to create a separate court for witchcraft. This didn't stop them from allowing spectral evidence, which is kind of that talking about spirits, spectral evidence, which included testimony about dreams and visions that were being used in court.
Spectral evidence isn't a thing anymore, is it?
Not that I'm aware of.
Oh, good.
But no, unfortunately, spectral evidence is not something we use anymore. These were being used in court through 1663, when a new superior court of judicature took over the trials and deemed that it was no longer appropriate to allow spectral evidence.
Oh, good.
So
Settles
it didn't last very long. But then why the Salem Witch Trials have kind of remained in public consciousness is because of how kind of dramatic and egregious that they were, but also because of just the it was a larger number than you would typically have in a regular community. And it was a large number in a very small community, or a large number of witches for a very small community. So during this time, 20 people were put on trial and put to death during the Massachusetts Salem Witch Trials in 1692. It began when 3 girls claimed to have strange visions. So first of all, a doctor was called in, examined these 3 girls, and diagnosed them with bewitchment. Today's theory is that they either had epilepsy, they were bored and wanted attention, they may have suffered from child abuse, a mental illness, or ate rye plagued by a fungus that caused delusions. So essentially, they took colonial mushrooms. So there are a number of different theories that could have led to their diagnosis of bewitchment, or led them to make the accusations that they did.
But none of
them
that
can
was
be
like
confirmed.
passive.
Exactly. It was all passive.
It wasn't like they were set out to be witches.
No, the 3 girls themselves were not the ones who believed they were witches. They just knew they had these visions and they didn't do anything.
Right. That's wrong.
It wasn't exactly. There wasn't anything. They were like, we didn't mean to have them. We just had a vision. And these girls blamed that odd behavior on 3 women in their community who were essentially considered to be social outcasts, including the famous Tituba, who was a slave woman. Her confession to witchcraft is believed to be coerced by local authorities. So they believe she was kind of pressured to admit to kind of making these girls have these visions that they did.
Oh, so sorry. So yeah. Those 3 girls were not then accused of being witches.
They were not the witches. The 3 girls weren't the witches. Okay. So they essentially said, we were just hanging out, doing our thing, and these 3 women from our community who are witches put a spell on us that made us have these weird visions. So they essentially said that they were hexed by these 3 people. And from so one of the first people that authorities called on and began questioning was this slave woman named Tituba. She confessed to witchcraft and started accusing other people that were believed to be witches. And from these 3 girls just saying that they had been hexed, essentially, 200 additional people were accused within the next year of committing witchcraft. So it just spiraled. Most of these accusations were made by family, friends, and neighbors, and it just became overwhelming for law enforcement, for the community. It was just, from one accusation, you'd get 10 more, and it just felt like there was no control over the situation.
Was there something that somebody can do? So if they were accused of being a witch, they just said, "I'm not a witch." I mean, how do you
there could be everything from just like how they would essentially, because only 20 people ended up officially being tried and executed during these trials, but there were 200 accusations throughout that year. So they would essentially do a preliminary investigation before actually accusing someone officially of being a witch. So the neighbor would go to the local magistrate and say, yeah, my neighbor's a witch. I'm going to need you to check her out. And then they would start asking questions of their family and other neighbors and try to corroborate that initial claim. And if it didn't seem substantial, they would just drop it. But if it did seem substantial, which it did in 20 cases, then it would actually go before a judge and be tried. Does that make sense?
I mean, no.
But
wasn't there
does that make
also-
sense the way I explained it?
It does,
It doesn't need
yes.
to make sense logically.
Wasn't there also a number of cases where I think there were a number of punishments that would theoretically prove you were or weren't
Yes.
a witch, but they would weigh a witch down with stone and then throw them in the river. And if
Yes.
they sank and drowned, that proved they were not a witch. But if they
Yes.
floated,
If they floated, they were a witch and they were going to be killed another way.
As seen in the famous
yes.
Monty Python movie.
so if you allowed yourself to die by whatever horrific mechanism they
Yeah.
had come up with, you were likely not a witch.
Build a bridge out of a... but no, witches are made of wood. But yes, there were multiple kind of physical trials that could be done, weighing a witch to see if she will actually float, or weighing her down with rocks to see if she'll float or drown. Fire was a big one. If she could stop the fire from burning her skin, she was not a witch. Or she was a witch. If she burned, she wasn't. But at that point, some of these trials would cause death in and of themselves. So there really was no winning if you were accused of witchcraft. And it was local magistrates who did the questioning and formal accusing, and then also the ones determining guilt. So we didn't have the trial by jury that we have today. But one thing that's kind of interesting is that the Salem witch trials in general, were not exclusive to Salem. They happened in all of these kind of early New England colonies. They happened over in England. They were happening in other countries around the world. And we're in D.C. here at the National Law Enforcement Museum. But near to us, because D.C. existed ways after kind of those initial colonies, Maryland was one of those New England colonies, and they had plenty of witch accusations of their own. One of those cases was Rebecca Fowler from Calvert County. She was accused of being led by the devil to injure a man named Francis Sansbury, and she evidently used witchcraft to do this. Witchcraft and sorcery. She used that in 1685. She was actually found guilty by a jury rather than just the judge themselves, and she was hanged. And that's pretty local to us as well.
Yeah, so I think I know somebody by that name too, but maybe a descendant.
Maybe.
But so I looked it up because that was an interesting story, and plus because it's local. And I got some kinfolk from around that area. So I looked it up, and sure enough, she has her own Wikipedia page. That's pretty, that's pretty cool.
And I think it's also interesting that her actual trial took place before the Salem witch trials did. So these had been trials and accusations of witchcraft were going on long before the 1690s. And this was only about 10 years before, but still, it's very relevant.
Can I read her story?
Go ahead. Yeah, read her story for us.
Right. So this is what happened to Rebecca Fowler. So she came over from England to Maryland, which was a province, and she was an indentured servant. This was in 1656. So she was indentured to George Collins, who was a shoemaker and a tobacco farmer. So once she was freed from her servitude, she married a guy named John Fowler, who was also a former indentured servant. When they got married, they purchased land and then eventually kept indentured servants of their own, which is just blows my mind.
And it was a good indentured servitude, especially at this time, was a good way for people who wanted to get out of England to get out, have a lot of their needs cared for once they were over. because they were essentially going to, the person who paid for them to come over, they're going to just work their farm, or and it was cheaper to pay for someone to come over from England and kind of give them room and board than it was to pay them a wage. So that was kind of, or cheaper for them anyway, cheaper for the owner of the farm. Yeah.
So guess who was one of their indentured servants?
I'm going to guess it's Francis Sainsbury.
It's Francis Sainsbury. Yeah. So the evidence against Rebecca was not presented to the public during her witchcraft trial. Only Francis Sainsbury is named as an accuser. However, court records mention, quote, several others who were unnamed. So despite Rebecca's status as a landowner, and Sainsbury's status as an indentured servant, the jurors believed Sainsbury's account. The jury stated its view that Fowler was guilty, but left the final determination of guilt to the judge. So the Prince George's County Court, PG County, concluded that Rebecca Fowler, on or about August 31st, 1685, having not the fear of God before her eyes, but being led by the instigation of the devil, certain evil and diabolical arts called witchcrafts, enchantments, charms, and sorceries, wickedly, devilishly, and feloniously at Mount Calvert and several other places, did use, practice, and exercise in, upon, and against one Francis Sainsbury.
There's so many adjectives in that sentence.
I mean, that is not easy to read.
No,
that's a great skill. So the judge ordered that Fowler be hanged by the neck until dead. So she was executed October 9th, 1685 in St. Mary's City, Maryland. Mount Calvert is now maintained as the Mount Calvert Historical and Archaeological Park. So you can go there and visit. Yeah. Yep.
And all of those places are, like, you can still visit Salem and all of those sites as well. So it's very, it's a bigger part of our history and kind of the history of our early justice systems than we really expect it to be.
Yeah, or want to admit.
Or want to admit,
yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, so the Salem Witch Trials are kind of something that still remains in a big area of question, a big area of interest here in the United States, and even more so around this time of year. So I'm glad we were able to kind of come together and talk about that, and even hear the story of Rebecca Fowler too, to kind of give us that not only a good wrap up to this episode, but kind of a look in the actual experience of someone who would have gone through something like this at the time.
Yeah, thanks, Anna.
Of course.
Thanks for putting us together.
Yeah, thanks, Anna.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Happy to bring us some good additional content.
Yeah.
And that's kind of relevant to this time of year. So, yeah.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Nice.
Thank you for listening to this special episode of Precinct 444, covering the history of the Salem Witch Trials. Check out other episodes of Precinct 444, including Encore, Lifeline, and Law and Disorder, on your favorite podcasting platforms. Any comments or suggestions for future shows? Email us at precinct444@nleomf.org.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.